Hi, my name is David Zyla, and I'm a member of the National Arts Club in New York City. The National Arts Club is a nonprofit arts club located on Gramercy Park, and the club has been around for over 120 years and creates programming, about 150 of them throughout the year, in person at the club that are free and open to the public. So if you are in the New York City area in the future, once things change, we would love to see you there. In the meantime, we have launched the NAC at Home series. And today, I'm very excited to share with you a very special guest. Let me tell you about her. Dr. Alison Matthews David is an associate professor and graduate program director of the MA Fashion program in the School of Fashion, Ryerson University. She was awarded a doctorate from Stanford University, has published on 19th century dress and material culture, and launched the journal Fashion Studies with Dr. Ben Berry. Her most recent research project, Fashion Victims, looked at how clothing physically harmed the health of its makers and wearers. It was published as a book in 2015, was a co-curated exhibition at the Bata Shoe Museum from 2014 to 2018, and as of April 2019, co-authored a book for children 9 to 12 called Killer Style. Her current project, Unraveling Crime, A Forensic History of Fashion, investigates the theme of crime and clothing as weapon, evidence, and disguise. Unraveling Crime's first outcome is a collaborative exhibition in February 2021 on crime and footwear, co-curated with Elizabeth Semmelhack, senior curator of the Bata Shoe Museum, and entitled Exhibit A. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Alison Matthews David. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really honored to be here today, and I have very, very fond memories of being at the National Arts Club and presenting in person, so hopefully that will happen again someday.
We will do that again.
In the meantime, I'm really pleased to meet everyone virtually.
Excellent. So would you tell us a little bit about today's subject, and then we could probably go right into your presentation.
Of course. Yeah, I thought what I would do today is just kind of summarize some of the things that I've both researched and been thinking about for a while, but also kind of relating them to what's going on in our current situation. So yeah, which is still obviously unfolding, so to speak, before our eyes. So I thought it would be, yes, I mean, I've always maintained an interest in how clothing can both harm and protect us. So those are some of the themes I'll talk about today in various ways. So, so I'll share my PowerPoint with you right now. Is that great? Okay, let me get that up and running. Okay, share. We're all getting used to this new Zoom universe, so here we are. All right. So yes, so some thoughts on sort of, I've called it, well, there is an actual chapter in my book called Germ Warfare, but I thought I'd call it Thoughts on the History of Dress and Danger. But to start, protection is one of the principal functions of dress. As fashion scholars, we often ignore the question of how dress protects us. Instead, we emphasize dress's more glamorous sisters, adornment and decoration. Yet clothing and accessories mediate between our fragile bodies and the hazards of the outside world. We can design clothing to protect us in the complex environments we encounter when diving underwater, walking in space, and now in hospitals contaminated with a potentially deadly virus. So this talk will look at take a brief look at some of the key clothing-related issues around how we are dressing emerging during this pandemic, as well as the longer history of clothing as a form of protection, especially as it relates to protecting humans from epidemic disease. I also want to think about how the dangers of being in public from the perspective of my most recent project on clothing and crime. One of the sections of my Unraveling Crime project examines accessories as weapons and protective devices in the 19th and early 20th century. I'll draw on that research in progress, and I'll explore a bit about how dress and accessories have been imagined and used in self-defense and social distancing historically and today. Finally, as a dress historian, I also want to note that for me, dress connotes everything that we put on our bodies, as well as the ways in which we adorn them. But when luxury companies like Chanel get into the mask business and supply hospitals, we can also consider how these things relate to the fashion industry and fashion systems. So, as a note, I saw this, I think, yesterday in the New York Times. So clearly the question of clothing and disease are really very much on people's minds, not surprisingly, I suppose. But I just kind of wanted to make a note about language, because the media focus has largely not been on obviously on clothing, kind of everyday dress and the things that civilians are wearing, but it's been on what is interestingly called personal protective equipment. And I came up with a pun of, don we now our safe apparel, basically. I mean, and we are all doing that to greater or lesser extent, but anyhow. But this idea of personal protective equipment, rather than what I would call occupational dress or protective gear, much like something like aprons or even the welder's helmets and the ski goggles that have been adapted to medical use of late. But when one is dressing so-called frontline workers, soldiers fighting a war against a virus, which is how the pandemic has been articulated, the more military equipment is not a surprising choice of terminology, perhaps. And also, I've been thinking a lot about these terms of donning and doffing as important. In an age of pandemic, many are not now simply putting on or taking off their clothes as usual. Donning actually comes from to do on, sort of a medieval use, and doffing from to do off. We might doff our hat. But it implies now the procedural, step-by-step, deliberate dressing and undressing that frontline workers and healthcare professionals must do to protect themselves, their patients, and their families from contamination. So, of course, not everyone is dressing to go out and sort of directly fight the disease, but of course, a lot of us are kind of in our home environments, and social media has become a way of kind of, if we can't display what we're wearing in public, we've used social media to kind of sometimes very creatively express how we're dressing in different ways, or maybe we're not, but how we're kind of adapting our dress to the new situation. And I love this work from home fits count, for example, where one person, people are sort of displaying their outfits. I love joyous blue layers, do not need pants from this one. And then another project that a New Yorker is doing called Quarantine Spring Summer 20. And I featured on it dressed as in various guises, but also I love this Noemi, people playing around. Noemi, who is in Budapest, she was getting maybe a bit bored with all the Zoom meetings, and she took out her makeup kit and became her alter ego Dave for her latest meeting. So I thought that the people are really doing interesting things, I think, with new ways of dressing and presenting their identity under difficult conditions. So, and then finally, I guess I love these memes about kind of how we thought we might dress to protect ourselves, and then here's how I expected my apocalypse outfit to look, but how I actually look is I'm muffled up in my cozy pink bathrobe and just trying to make it through the day. So are we seeking protection, or are we actually just seeking kind of comfort, if we can find it? So to go to the research I did for fashion victims, I wrote a chapter called Germ Warfare in my book, which looks specifically at how textiles transmitted contagious disease, not so much how it protected people, but with our convenient hot water washing machines and detergents, we seldom think of clothing as a carrier of disease. But people feared contaminated clothing and linens long before germ theory was common knowledge. And on the left, this was kind of the key image for today, because with the advent of germ theory, fears were fanned in a new way, like this 1900 image of what were dubbed septic skirts from the American magazine Puck. And I'll just unpack it a little bit because there's a lot going on in it. And it's in New York, an image of women walking with their trailing skirts out on public sidewalks. And as you can see, the kind of fashionable wearer has brought all of these germs and microbes that are being brushed out of her skirt home. And so you can see the clouds of influenza, consumption, typhoid fever, and death looming above the innocent children and their little puppy. So but who's at danger, who's at risk here? It's the maid actually brushing all the dust out. So I think this is quite a pretty interesting image in light of what's going on today. But of course, people were worried about where did bacteria or where did germs accumulate on clothing? Was it in pockets? Was it on hems? There was sort of, it fanned all of these new fears about where germs might lurk when germ theory became common knowledge, and new ideas about disinfecting clothing that are still with us today. And then finally, to go even further back, there's the tale of the ancient Greek tale of the cloak of Nessus, which was a poisoned garment that killed the seemingly invincible hero Heracles or Hercules. It burned up his body with fever when he put it on. And what's interesting about this is that before, again, germ theory, people conflated often ideas of poison and of epidemic disease. So they both kind of burned the body up. So those were the epidemic disease and poison were kind of similar in the imagination and in the understanding of people. During the Renaissance, armies actually threw clothing worn by the sick over the walls of besieged cities in a real example of germ warfare. And of course, most infamously, they're the horrific smallpox infected blankets and linens that were treacherously given to indigenous native populations as supposedly peaceful gifts in the 18th centuries. And these came from smallpox hospitals. Because of its intimate contact with our skin, in malevolent hands, cloth can become a weapon, unfortunately. But just to kind of go back to that puck caricature, this was a very real concern that women were bringing home germs on their long trailing skirts, because that was the fashion even for promenade dress, to have like this woman with this kind of amazing tricorn straw hat and stripy black and white dress. You can see that even her walking dress trails on the ground. Here it looks pretty all right, but there were sort of rainy day clubs where women said that on rainy days they would hitch up their skirts higher. And on the left, I'm showing you some really ingenious early 20th century, what were called skirt grips. And so they were actually little devices you could use to hitch up your skirt from the ground so that it wouldn't trail and collect germs when you went outside. And, you know, again, we always think of hemlines changed, okay, fashion's changed, and we look at the flapper. And after seeing all these images and caricatures, I can't help but think that one of the reasons why skirts shortened was also because of a fear was for hygiene and kind of fear of disease. So a lot of different factors, but I always think of hygiene as well as a rationale for this new kind of silhouette for women as it developed. And then one of the other case studies I looked at, and again, this case study in particular made me glad for my washing machine, but was the ways in which when people couldn't launder their clothes, they were really at risk of diseases that are almost all but eradicated now, or they're not common. In particular, the disease typhus. And typhus was spread by body lice. There are several different types of lice, but body lice would hide in the seams of clothing. And when you couldn't launder them, then it would happen in places like ships and jails, and also soldiers on campaign who couldn't launder their linens. And in fact, they excavated a Napoleonic grave. I'm showing you some wonderfully outfitted Napoleonic soldiers here in their really amazing uniforms, but these uniforms harbored, unfortunately, these body lice who had spread disease. And they excavated a mass grave where they actually found these lice, and they tested the DNA of soldiers, and they found that many of them had succumbed not to battle or to cold, but to disease, to typhus. So it was really something we've kind of forgotten about, but it recurred any time that there were people in close quarters, people who weren't able to launder their shirts. And in fact, it's the origin of the idea of the cootie. You have cooties and you kind of vaccinate people for cooties. And there was even a cootie game, which struck me as quite funny, that people may have played in their childhoods. But you can see on the left a soldier in the trenches of World War I. And this is a soldier literally picking the lice out of the seams of his uniform. And you can see a little sign, it's been annotated, and it says trenches, and it points to the trenches behind him. And then the same person has written, "This bird is killing cooties." So he's killing the lice that would cause typhus. And of course, this was very culturally different. But in France, lice were actually considered good luck. So, so you have this little kind of pretty racy postcard where it's about the soldier going on leave, and he meets his sweetheart and gives her these body lace, and she says, "Oh, yeah, that's great. It will bring luck." So, you know, very, very different attitude towards body lace and potential contagion here. But yes, so this was the reality of how clothing could harbor and transmit contagious disease. And again, as I said, like sort of now we think a lot less about that, but it's certainly something that's in the public imagination and the public discourse about how long can things live on clothes. And in fact, what I found interesting is that historically, clothing that was thought to be more porous, like things like wool or feathers or fur, were considered more dangerous than things that were more tightly woven and shiny and repellent, things like either waxed cottons or waxed fabrics or satins even, because satins are very tight weaves. So I think that's quite interesting. I've heard a bit of the same type of discourse coming up, so it's actually scientifically true. So that's quite interesting and something to follow and learn more about as I go along. Okay, I wanted to kind of talk about two particular accessories that have really come to the forefront, I think. But I'm going to start with gloves, because before the 20th century, elite men and women rarely went outside without wearing gloves. And I've got Titian's Man with a Glove from the 16th century here, and a pair of early 17th century gloves from Scotland. These are ladies' gloves on the right, but they rarely went outside without wearing gloves. People did not shake or clasp bare hands. In an age when disease was thought to be miasmatic, in other words, transmitted by bad smells rather than bacteria or viruses, gloves were perfumed with sweet scents that were thought to protect their wearers. In our new regime of physical distancing, we are all rethinking what we touch and how we touch it in real and everyday ways. Could that doorknob, package, or supermarket cart be infected? Should I wear latex gloves? Are my gloves themselves infected now? And the dilemma reminded me of one of my favorite print series by the German artist, Max Klinger. This is one of them. And it's called, you know, appropriately enough, it's called Ängste, or Fears, from his 1881 series, A Glove. And it shows a dreaming man who, with outsized, menacing gloves and figures rising from the ocean to grasp at him. We are in some ways back in a world where touch is constantly hovering at the forefront of our awareness again, when we hope desperately that gloves will create a safe boundary between us and the virus. Brief discourse on gloves, but masks are also very important, and they have many different meanings and designs depending on the time, place, culture, and the function of the mask worn. And obviously there's a huge contrast, but I'm showing you a plague doctor on the left, who was one of the people who wore an oilcloth or kind of waxed robe, which was thought to be protective, but also these kind of now famous sort of plague masks that had sweet smells in the beak that were thought to be protective, but also Chanel, which is kind of the more modern version of it, but certainly a luxury version. But they have actually, because fashion companies have the kind of know-how and often the equipment and materials, many of them have turned to making not things just for public consumption and kind of showing your branded status, but also for helping the effort. And they're sending them to hospitals in France as well. So in Western Europe, they've long been an elite fashion item worn by ladies outdoors to protect their skin from dust and wind, as in this Wenceslas Haller image of an English woman in a black half mask in 1643. So in contemporary Asia, wearing a mask is a sign of community mindedness. You're protecting others from you and visibly demonstrating that you're a responsible citizen. During this pandemic, this is becoming increasingly our more positive understanding of them in the West, as top medical officials recommend that everyone wear one in public spaces if possible. In Western culture, masking the face has long been viewed with suspicion and distrust. As I'm finding in my current crime project, they're associated directly with criminality in disguise. And, you know, this is not a surprise, I suppose, but, you know, you think of the masked bandit, for example. I'm just showing you here one of the items that I got to see finally last year in the famous Scotland Yard Crime Museum in London. And these are masks that were kind of, as you can see, very improvised and kind of cut out of stockings and tied with twine to, in theory, disguise the identities of the wearers in what a burglary turned into a murder, and it was not successful. These men were caught and hanged, but again, we associate this type of masking the face with criminality. But again, it still depends on the bodies who are wearing them. To my horror, it's still not possible for many men of African descent to wear them in public in the USA, for example, even to innocently shop for groceries, lest they be seen as dangerous. But on the flip side, there has been a move by designers, home crafters, and journalists, and even our School of Fashion faculty, to make patterns and instructions for sewing or creating simple masks available for free online. And I'm going to participate in this project to sew masks, not for frontline workers, but for people who need them in hospitals. So I think there's been a real, in this wonderful article, and interesting, again, the military terminology, that there's a sewing army. Clothing can help us reinforce the social fabric. People knitted in order to send warm socks, scarves, and balaclavas like this to soldiers on the front during both world wars. Now we're sewing masks and gowns. I think it's fascinating that during this pandemic, home sewing has risen in status and is once again appreciated as an essential and potentially life-saving skill. So lots to think about in terms of that. Now I thought I'd just sort of kind of wrap up with thinking about how people have maintained spaces between themselves in often very crowded public spaces. And obviously this is something we're thinking about a lot right now. And in terms of fashion history, what I've seen the most are sort of memes about the crinoline in particular, or the mantua, like these wide kind of skirt supports that are often seen as ridiculous and kind of caricatured, but you know, a lot of people are thinking, maybe they had a point, you know. And so here's an example from the conversation of Ina Ravinovich-Fox, who's written about the fashionable history of social distancing. And as you can imagine, the crinoline, you can see the crinoline featured front, wide, and center right here as a form of social distancing. But I thought I would also just bring in a few more examples that I've seen of ways that men and women maintain their space in public, often in relation to not just disease, but other kinds of dangers. But one example that became quite notorious in the early 20th century was the hat pin for women. And these were obviously, these had a function because before, women would, you know, protect their hair and their, you know, kind of faces, wearing bonnets, like the one on the left in the Victorian period. But by the early 20th century, hats were getting bigger and bigger and harder to keep on the head. And so women started using hat pins to make sure that these hats were secured, because you couldn't go out, you know, not without a hat in public. And so often, as you can see from the examples I'm showing here, there were very beautiful items in and of themselves, but they were used in a range of different ways. And I give you a new, again, the hats got caricatured, but in particular, one hat that was dubbed the Merry Widow hat, and it was worn on Broadway in a production. But I love this image of a woman, you know, trying to get on the omnibus, and it's making me envious of her giant flower platter here, but it's keeping the person behind her at a distance. And often it's sort of women trying to keep men at a distance at this point, because there were men called mashers who would you know, and we've all experienced this on the sidewalk, people walking too close, and you know, you want them to keep their distance. And so one example of a masher was this one on the left. A Kansas woman came to New York as a tourist. An elderly man came too close, so she simply pulled her hat pin out and stabbed him in the arm, and he got off the omnibus. So, you know, she said, maybe women in New York will stand for this, but I'm a good Kansas girl, I won't take it. And so she used her hat pin to keep to maintain her distance. And then on the right, this is a more strategic use, there are all these instructional manuals in how to defend yourself, or articles in newspapers. It was sort of fashionable self-defense. And this woman pulling the hat pin out from her hat and using it to defend herself from an assailant behind her. So there's kind of a how-to. And then finally, it got to the point, I love this little diagram of sort of the popularity of women's weapons. And as you can see, broom handles are very practical, but hat pins are not to be neglected, and hairbrushes, they come in at 6 and 7 respectively. So kind of accessories used for defense. And then for men, if we go back slightly earlier to the 19th century, there was a great fear over what was called the garrotting panic in the 1850s and 60s. And here I'm showing you the kind of typical garrotting robbery where a middle-class man, would be approached by two thieves, and one would grab him around the neck while the other took his pocket watch and his pocketbook, his wallet. So you can see that sort of happening in action here. And so people imagined all sorts of accessories and kind of how would people defend themselves? How would men defend themselves against this kind of assault? And there's a lot of making fun of sort of men who might have overdone it, like this guy, Tompkins, who's, let him try it on. But the police, that said, the police actually did wear spiked collars to protect themselves from this form of attack. And they patented things like an anti-garrotting cravat that had little spikes hidden behind the silk tie in case someone should grab you by the neck. They would get a little nasty surprise. So this was a real sort of fear, and there were actual designs to counter it and to kind of protect the wearer in public space. And then, of course, there were other perhaps more criminal manifestations of that. This was a young man called Liabeuf in Paris who had been falsely accused of a crime, and he was a shoemaker and armorer, so he built his own kind of weapon, cuffs and sleeves, and then went out and actually ended up killing a police officer. But he used his kind of know-how to create this sort of protective device that would make it hard to capture him and to approach him. So lots of different permutations of this. In the more fashionable vein, though, there were all sorts of publications on sort of how to defend yourself in the street. There were courses you could take in cane fighting. It was kind of you could buy these elegant sword canes, so it would look like a cane, but you might be able to use it to learn how to defend yourself in the street. And I'm giving you an example of these kinds of instructional manuals, these very elegant guys in boaters using a combination of kickboxing and, of course, cane fighting to attack and defend themselves. It's a bit of a fantasy, but I think it's really interesting that that this was, a way of sort of, in theory, countering threats that would come in public on the street. So to conclude, I'm showing you one of my favorite caricatures from the magazine Punch in London from 1856, and again in reaction to this garrotting panic. And it shows Mr. Tremble, who borrows his wife's crinoline. And I'm going to contrast it with sort of what we do today. But while Punch's caricature mocks the fearful and cowardly Mr. Tremble, who uses his wife's crinoline to protect himself from crime and danger in the streets of Victorian London, not everyone can keep their social distance in today's pandemic, including essential workers and frontline medical staff and caregivers. With our better understanding of the transmission of disease and germ theory today, the act of donning protective gear like these suits is an act of courage. It is a new hero's uniform worn by those whose professions do not allow them to physically distance themselves from danger. For the rest of us, it may be cozy bathrobes and pajamas at home, or perhaps more glamorous and experimental outfits and makeup appearing on social media. But when we go out, we may don our cloth masks, our scarves, our bandanas to face, so to speak, the new world in which we now live, if we can. But unfortunately, until we develop a vaccine, it will be a world fraught with the dangers of contagious disease. In conclusion, I'm still thinking about how these dangers were actually familiar to the people whose historical dress I study, people who donned their sweetly scented leather gloves and hiked up their long septic skirts with skirt grips in sartorial efforts to ward off disease. We have more protective tools in our closets now, but all of our efforts and ingenuity are still needed to protect the vulnerable, from making homemade masks to designing better and more accessible protective gear for frontline workers. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, so much to think about. And as always, I've been fortunate enough to see you do a few lectures, which actually I'm going to ask you about in a moment. But your content and clearly the love of your subject really shows. So thank you so much for sharing that. I have a bunch of questions for you, and then we're going to open it up to our audience for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them in and we'll get to them shortly. Today's lecture, I know, is customized a little bit, but a lot of it is from your wonderful book, Fashion Victims, which I highly recommend. And my question is, what prompted your writing Fashion Victims?
That's an incredible, yeah, that's a good question. I'm always rethinking that question. Initially, I think it was growing up with my dad, who was a photographer, and I grew up in a domestic environment that had a dark room and a studio and chemicals that were dangerous in the basement, but then this kind of retouching and transformation and photographing people to make them look glamorous. So kind of an early understanding of the kind of not so pretty processes that were often involved in kind of making people look good, I suppose. So I guess I come by it very personally. But then when I became a professor at, well, not a full professor, but when I started working in the UK teaching, we went to Manchester on field trips. We took our students up to Manchester, so the center of the cotton industry. And it was the first time I'd really seen, we would go and see sort of the Museum of Science and Technology and all of the machines. And in fact, one thing that struck me is that was the first time I understood how, like, these kind of working conditions in a bit more of a physical way, because one of the things they would do in these cotton mills was they had kissing shuttles. They had these shuttles that they had to actually physically suck the straw or suck the thread in to get the spindles to work, and they would actually pass disease, like tuberculosis, for example, from one to the other. And it was already an environment where you coughed and where it was, full of cotton dust. And so I guess that really, people were getting trapped in the machinery. So it really kind of viscerally got me interested in this topic.
Wow, fascinating background. And so when you started writing the book, I'm curious, what was your process? And then my second question with that is, what were the unexpected discoveries along the way?
Oh, it was both a long process, and it did contain many interesting kind of eureka moments, I think. Because it really took me about a decade to do the research and to kind of get it written. And partly because I was in so many different places. I was trying to find, I had read that there were toxic dyes in the 1930s. So one of my favorite discoveries was I was up in Manchester again at their costume museum, and the curator left. I was in an attic full of stuff, and I was looking for 1860s men's socks that were stripy and kind of had these synthetic aniline dyes. And nobody had kind of looked for them before, but I unearthed these socks, and I was incredibly excited. And then other moments were like in the Wellcome Library, which is like a medical library, just reading and learning about how interested doctors were in all of these problems. Because what I figured out is, like, we often approach fashion through these visual channels. What does it look like? But doctors who think about the physiology and sort of how we breathe, what we eat, they were interested in kind of problems that chemical toxins like toxic dyes, arsenical green pigments, the Mad Hatters and mercury poisoning that was happening to them for making men's fashionable hats. Like, they were interested in how the body kind of ate and breathed, and like the skin and things that we don't always think about in the same ways in fashion. So I learned so much from that.
So you touched upon a moment ago, would you, I think, again, there's so much wonderful material in your book, but would you touch upon the Mad Hatter and some of the other, I don't know, maybe the color green, for instance?
Yeah, yeah.
That are also very dangerous fashion choices.
Yeah, what was really interesting, I mean, I had already always, I mean, everyone's heard of the stereotype of the Mad Hatter, but I really didn't know what kind of the depth of the issues behind that kind of amazing figure that we all know and love. And when I started kind of unpacking just how complex it was and how long, for 200 years, men's fashionable hats were made, it was actually a kind of, they were made using mercury because beaver hats didn't need mercury. It was like a luxury fabric, but when every man wanted to wear a hat, the dangers of democracy and everyone having that was that they used rabbit or hare fur. And so, you know, in order to make that turn into felt, you needed mercury, or you didn't need it. There were other ways, but the cheapest and most efficient thing was to use mercury, which actually turned it orange. It was called carroting, and meant that hatters, the environments that they worked in, you know, were poisoned essentially, often very chronically, and caused early death to the makers. But because because it didn't, I mean, hats were lined, the consumers didn't really know. So the only people who knew were medical professionals, and even then. And so the consumers weren't afraid of the problem, and it wasn't considered an issue. Whereas in the opposite case happened for green pigments, when this new fashionable color fast bright green called different things, but called emerald green or Sheila's green was invented. It was used for dyeing textiles, wallpaper, all sorts of consumer products, because it was really vivid and everyone loved it and it was fashionable and modern, and everyone wanted a piece of this green, sort of green color. But what happened was that it was used to make things like artificial leaves for flowers that decorated women's dresses or textiles, and it harmed young girls and women and young girls were thought to be in need of protection. And so the kind of public campaigns to protect people against these toxins were totally different and had a totally different story from other dangers. And, you know, people blew the whistle, they got chemists to test them and broadcast how deadly they were, and the color went out of fashion.
So you touched upon your theory that one of the reasons that the flapper came to be was to, how would I say, not have disease on her skirt anymore. Do you find in researching all of this, this book that you wrote and so on, do you find that as a society that we typically, how would I say, go in a different direction when we have found that something is health-wise not good for us, or do we more often say, I really like that, okay, we'll make it safe? Or is there a combination of both?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a kind of a complex one. And, you know, what I did find, and sometimes was dismayed to find, was like when the problem would get solved, like people wanted to figure this out, but then sometimes another problem would arise because of it's sort of a case of technological, I don't know, you know, I do genuinely positively believe that technology can help our health, for example. And one example I would give was something, again, like, and as we're all lounging around in our pajamas, one of the dangers that I wasn't expecting to find was flannelette, you know, the kind of cozy cotton fabric that many of us have nice pajamas made out of. Flannelette was a cheap knockoff of woolen flannel that was thought to protect people from drafts and catching illnesses. So you would wear a flannel waistcoat, men would wear them, or a flannel belt under your clothes to protect you from cold and catching chills and fevers, or that's what they thought. But they made a kind of, in the late 19th century, they invented, you know, flannelette. So kind of knockoff cotton flannel, which was cheaper. Wool flannel was expensive, and this wonderful cotton flannelette did keep people cozy. But what they found was that the working classes were dressing their children in these like cotton flannelette nightgowns, and unfortunately there were open fires and coal fires and flames in these houses, and children weren't always supervised. And so flannelette, unfortunately, was highly flammable, and a lot of children, unfortunately, caught on fire, or women, you know, obviously with long flowing garments, was more dangerous. But that said, you know, the person, actually a chemist, developed a whole kind of non-flamm, so it was called non-flammable flannelette. So he invented a treatment that could, and he would go around doing demonstrations, including in New York. He would set a washerwoman's apron on fire to prove that his non-flamm worked. But he actually ended up donating the patent to the nation. because it would protect the nation's children. So, you know, sometimes there really were innovations that would protect people's health.
Wonderful. Thank you. You know, one of the things you touched upon was you were showing a lot of people's, you know, at-home wear and how people are expressing themselves. One of the things that I've been noticing is this trend of wearing your finest dress to go to the grocery store. How would you classify that? Is that protest? Is that merely just self-expression?
I think this is really a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, I have seen some people dressed to the nines, yeah, at the kind of when everyone else is in their like PJs or their, you know, sweatpants, or I love the dress sweatpants. That's pretty great. I just got an ad for them. But I mean, I guess it's partly like you look through your closet and, you know, all of these things you can't really wear, or, you know, you don't have an occasion. So why not wear them for the grocery store? And I guess what I didn't have a chance to talk about in this project particularly, but I think there's a lot left to explore, is kind of the link between our mental and our psychological health in relation to what we're wearing. And if it makes you feel good to wear your, you know, your glamorous stuff to the supermarket, why shouldn't you? And it, you know, so it actually, I think a lot of people maybe, you know, it's mixed feelings, but I think it's actually kind of nice, for example, today to have an occasion to dress up a bit more and maybe not, and kind of wear something a bit more fun and fashionable.
Buy the dress and find the occasion to wear it, right?
Exactly.
And who knew, right? What would you classify as the most recent dangerous fashion?
Oh boy, that's a really good question. I mean, it's funny because I mean, as I said, it's sort of contingent on like who's wearing it and what's getting worn. I mean, again, because fashion changes so much, it's like the hazards kind of shift. Luckily, I mean, what I would say is that we live or we lived until recently in a world that had fewer hazards than, you know, we don't have that many, like what I found from, say, for example, even the crinoline. When I look at the crinoline, yes, it gives us this social distance potentially, and women certainly thought of it that way. It gave them space in public, and people couldn't touch them or grab them. But at the time, it was also a fire hazard because there were so many open flames around. And the only recent case I found of a kind of skirt being a fire hazard was someone who was wearing kind of, when the boho chic look was wearing a kind of quote unquote sort of flowy skirt, you know, boho chic skirt, and it caught on a tea light because she was dancing around. But again, with modern medical technology, they were able to kind of to save her and to you know. So I guess I don't really have a good like, I'll have to kind of think about it. But I don't find. I mean, for me, it's also I think things come on our radar when they're hazardous to the wearers. But I think the kind of the dangers to the makers are always there in fashion, and certainly it's even exacerbated with what's going on right now. The kind of power and income divides between the global north and the global south.
You spoke a little bit about your most recent research, fashion and crime. Would you tell us a little bit about that project?
Of course, and I think I might be able to, I don't know if I can, let me just share the screen again, because I just have one more slide to show you, because there's some, just in case people are interested. Let me just go to the next slide if I can.
And while she's pulling that up, I just want to remind our viewers, if you have any questions for Alison, we'll be getting to those in just a moment.
Yeah, I have a last slide. Just basically the crime project, it'll be a book in a few years, but before that happens, there are two kind of things to flag up. And one will be our exhibition at the Badashi Museum that I'm co-curating with Elizabeth Semmelhack. It's called Exhibit A, and it's going to look at how we investigate crime in footwear. In particular, you know, the image of the detective hot on the trail, the footprints, and kind of from Sherlock Holmes to kind of to now, and how forensics still uses footprints and other marks, and how clothing can be an important clue. So there's Exhibit A that is slated to open in February 2021. So please come up to Toronto and see the exhibition. It should be up for 18 months. And then we're also, I would invite you to either submit something or to come up and participate in our Fabric of Crime Symposium. And we are also welcoming creative work around this theme of clothing. Wait, I don't know if I can go to the next slide, but anyway. But basically, we're doing it with the Costume Society of America, their Midwestern region. So the Fabric of Crime call for papers is there, or call for creative work, and that's going to be in October 2021. So there's lots of kind of interesting new emerging research around this area. So
wonderful. And the research for that has taken you absolutely everywhere, hasn't it?
It has, just like Fashion Victims. I often bounce around, but I've spent a lot more time than I ever thought I would in police archives and museums, because as it turns out, the early forensic pioneers were really interested in fashion and clothing. And in fact, even the word clue itself is a textile term. So a clue was a ball of yarn. And you'd follow the clue, like the kind of the thread of the Minotaur, of Ariadne, through the Minotaur's labyrinth. So this idea of being on the trail of textiles is kind of, it's very what I'm doing. And it's taken me to some fantastic places, including, I mean, I was so happy to go to the Scotland Yard Crime Museum, which is very difficult to get into, but they have, it's been a museum. They've collected things since the 19th century, and they have just unparalleled interesting things. And we're hoping to get one of their items as well for our show in Toronto.
And the date of the show is when?
It's slated to be February 2021. So
excellent. All right, excellent. We look forward to that. I am curious, when you are working on a project, you literally, having seen now, I've seen Fashion Victims as a book, as an exhibit, I've seen a lecture on it. Your amount of research and material is just so tremendous, and so, how would I say, delicious for all of us to take in. It's a rich, full meal. How many hours, days, weeks, years goes into writing a book like this and doing research like this?
Well, again, I mean, this is not the kind of, quick fix sort of, I can't kind of just do a smash and grab, and because often these things crime historians haven't really looked at dress. They don't know so much about it. So it's kind of, I have to kind of go back into all of these archives, and there's one photographer in particular who worked in Switzerland, who was both an art photographer and an early forensic photographer, and he pioneered these amazing techniques like using blue filters to make blood appear again on when it had been washed out from clothing, for example. So kind of, I really have to actually go to Switzerland, go into the archives, look and see what they have, or go into just to kind of follow it. I follow things where they are, and I've been lucky enough to have a Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada research grant and a wonderful research assistant, Miriam Couturier, who was also with me on the Fashion Victims project, and she's an amazing sleuth as well. So I do have help, and then these amazing collaborators like Elizabeth Semmelhack. But yeah, I've been able to travel the world. I'm also looking at the Sydney Specials, which are these wonderful mugshots from 1920s Australia that are more like portraits and have been used as inspiration for shows like Peaky Blinders, or even fashion collections, because they're so interesting, and so such an interesting way into seeing what people wore every day on the street.
Fascinating. We're going to go to some questions, and Beth writes in, she would like to know, does Chanel produce the logo visor shown in your slide, or was it made specifically for that particular client?
I am guessing. That's a very good question, Beth. Thank you. I need to look into it some more, do some more investigation, but I think it's more of, that one was particularly for marketing, whereas I'm guessing it wouldn't, I don't think that they're so brand oriented that they would put the logos on for hospital use. So, but I'll look into it. I'll post on Twitter.
Excellent. And Lily Ann writes that there are many cultures throughout the world that where shoes are not allowed to be worn in the home. Why do you think that's something that has not caught on in North America, where we're a little bit germophobic? And yes, that's it.
That is also a really good question. And I wish Elizabeth Semmelhack were here from the BADA because she is the expert on all things shoes. So maybe she can speak to that too. But yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, people in the 19th century certainly did have outdoor shoes and indoor shoes. And we still do when we're wearing, like, you know, you wouldn't wear your rubber boots or your winter boots and track them around in the house. So it sort of depends on which footwear. You always had, there were slippers. What I think is really interesting is the flip side of that, speaking of fashion trends, of everyone wearing slides with like fluffy, you know, kind of the fashion for wearing indoor shoes outdoors now. It's kind of like there isn't, you're right, like considering how germaphobe we are often in North America, it is strange that that we don't kind of make more of a distinction and we wear like Uggs outdoors, which my Australian friend is horrified by, but, and we often, you know, wear our outdoor shoes indoors. I don't know. It's, I'm sure that even what I found in my research is that even before there was a kind of quote unquote medical knowledge of how germs were kind of, how disease was transmitted, that there would be, I mean, people were aware of hygiene and how you wouldn't want to track in sort of any more dirt than possible into the house in many cultures.
Ariel writes, do you think there will be a focus going forward of anti-bacterial fabrics and clothing?
Oh, so interesting. Yes, I looked into this a little bit before when I was doing fashion victims, because there definitely, I mean, there's already, as you may be aware, there are already fabrics that are, for example, woven with metal, with silver, which is antibacterial for workout wear because it combats smell and sweat and things like that. Or for example, in the case of diabetics, there are like nanoparticles of silver used in socks, so to protect from infection. So these things are certainly on people's radars, but I think, yeah, I'm guessing that there will be even more kind of innovation and exploration of how we could make our textiles even more protective.
Catherine writes in, what are some modern fashion items you do not wear because of the dangers you've learned about in your research? How dangerous is your closet, Alison?
What do I avoid? Yeah. Well, I think the main thing, I don't necessarily have anything that I sort of, you know, run screaming from necessarily, but I am very, very careful to launder everything before I wear it, because, and anything that I would put on my kids' bodies, or partly because there's so many kind of products used to, like pesticides and all sorts of things, even some of the dyes. One of my friends actually had read my book and he said, I was getting a rash from my socks and I thought of your book and I threw them out. And, you know, so yeah, so really it's kind of what I would say is, like, the closer something is to your body. What I learned, for example, was with the dyed socks that actually men and working class people and children were more at risk from these dyes because they sweat more, and their sweat kind of their sweat chemistry interacted with the sock dye. So, you know, like it's really, it sort of depends on who's wearing what. But I don't have anything that I particularly stay away from, I guess.
Okay. These are great questions. Thank you to our audience. Andrea writes, was the change in the shorter skirt lengths in the 1920s linked to the influenza pandemic in 1918? And were there other changes in fashion that can be traced back to that particular pandemic?
That is, again, like such a good question, and not one that I think we've really thought about as historians yet. I haven't seen, I mean, I'm definitely going to revisit, like, especially the typhus, like I have a lot more on sort of ideas around contagious disease around that period, that kind of pivotal period, but I haven't really, I know that the idea of wearing kind of masks originated, there's a great little history on Fast Company of the N95 mask. And one of the first kind of masks to protect, like to actually protect, was designed by a doctor in China. He was Chinese, and he kind of used medical supplies. He used gauze and pads to protect from what was then Manchurian kind of flu, I believe it was as well, another epidemic disease. And he designed it very carefully. And then a kind of French medical expert came in and said, oh, no, it's fine. And then he was dead within 2 days. So, you know, so this kind of idea of the mask in relation to kind of all the understanding, like typhus, the germ, or the typhus was discovered, what the causation, the agent for typhus was discovered in 1908. So, you know, then in World War I, they did actually kind of invent all of these special train cars where soldiers could put their uniforms and disinfect them. And, you know, they weren't always available. So again, you know, the kind of irony of it was, one of the kind of pieces of advice was that, you know, use this gas, you know, use the chemical gases you have to disinfect your uniforms, which was also toxic. So I don't know. That's a really, you know, I think people definitely were wearing cloth masks in relation to the Spanish flu, but I don't know about skirt lengths in relation to that. I'll look into it.
Excellent. And Kathy writes, have you done research on fabrics or garments that have technological components for surveillance or heat? And how might these be used to track disease?
That is a super, yeah, right, with all of the fever kind of sensing. I'm very interested in that. There's certainly been a lot of kind of exploring and experimentation with clothing that that has patterns that can't be detected by you know, kind of video surveillance or electronic surveillance, and kind of that's been played around with, or makeup that also like asymmetrical makeup that makes you so-called sort of invisible to surveillance. It doesn't recognize you as a human, you know, in relation to all this facial recognition stuff. That's definitely related to the crime material. But in terms of heat sensing, I mean, there's certainly been some interesting kind of garments in relation to going through body scanners at airplanes, like the sort of, you know, keep your eyes off me in fabric that luminesces when you go through it, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't know of anything in relation to heat, kind of masking heat yet. I think these are all just going to be topics that emerge and are going to be discussed and explored in this new context.
We could talk for hours, but we can't. So as someone who luckily was exposed to fashion and photography chemicals at a young age and followed their passion and their interests and made a fantastic career about them, what advice would you give to someone looking to make a career out of their very special interests?
Well, I guess it can be done. This is a case in point. I thought it was a niche interest, but apparently a lot of people are interested in it. So I think my advice would be believe in yourself too. And if you have this kind of what seems to be a sort of strange fascination with something, there are others out there who share that and who will be interested in it. And especially, I mean, I'm in the field of dress, but I think dress and fashion are such important. They're so often overlooked or scorned or kind of not taken seriously. But I think what I've also come to appreciate is just how important they are to our health, our well-being, our, you know, our world on so many levels that and that people are genuinely interested in learning more. So I guess I would just say, you know, follow that and be persistent and be stubborn. And people will say, oh no, that's not there. What do you mean? And you just have to kind of keep going and keep digging and keep investigating. I'm pretty stubborn, so.
Wonderful advice. Thank you. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts on this subject. Really wonderful work. and cannot wait to see your next exhibit. I want to thank our audience. My name is David Zyla, and again, you've been watching NAC at Home, produced by the National Arts Club in New York City. And if you'd like more information on our programs, you can go to the website, thenationalartsclub.org, or find us on Facebook or on YouTube. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you to the wonderful audience. I'm seeing your comments now, so thank you.